In this video, I'm going to show you how I set up Cymasphere to play orchestral chord voicings in my DAW. In this case, I'm using Cymasphere on iPad connecting to my Mac Studio computer. If you'd like to use a different configuration, check the links in the description for how to connect Cymasphere to your DAW using different devices. To start, physically connect the iPad to the computer. On the iPad, press Trust to allow the device to connect. Open Audio MIDI Setup and scroll down to the bottom of the list. You should see your iOS device. Press Enable to allow the iPad and Mac to communicate using MIDI. In Cymasphere, open the MIDI I/O devices menu from the sidebar and select IDAM MIDI for your output device. Cymasphere generates chord voicings, and we want each voice to be played by a different instrument in the DAW. Open the voice channel matrix in the sidebar. This is where you can assign each voice of your chord voicing to a different MIDI channel. Clear all the selections and hit the Cascade button. Keep in mind that the bass voice has its own discrete output, separate from the rest of the chord voicing. Voice 1 refers to the lowest sounding note in the voicing, voice 2 to the second lowest, and so on. By cascading the voice outputs, we send the bass voice out MIDI channel 1, voice 1 out MIDI channel 2, voice 2 out MIDI channel 3, etc. Lastly, let's enable some features that lend themselves nicely to generating smooth orchestral chordal textures. Let's enable voice lead for the palette. This is one of the best features in Cymasphere. When moving between two chords, voice lead finds the most efficient path for each voice to get from one chord to the next. The result is smooth transitions where voices move by the smallest possible distance to get to the target chord. Let's also enable sustained common tones for the palette. When a voicing shares notes in common, called common tones, with a previous chord, these voices will get held out instead of being stopped and started again. This allows common tones to stay sustained while only the new introduced voices are articulated. Let's set the palette to use ninth chords, which will add a bit of tension. This palette also uses a variety of other chords and the expressions feature, which I'll cover in a later video. If you have a Pro license, you can download this exact palette from the Cymasphere Universe menu in the sidebar under my artist profile, Ryan Johnson. Lastly, let's set voice count to 7. This feature will ensure that the chord voicing uses exactly 7 voices, plus the bass voice. Chords come in all shapes and sizes. For example, triads have natural voice count of 3, meaning that there are 3 unique pitches in a triad. If you play a triad with the voice count feature set to 7, 4 additional voices will be generated, which are duplicates of the pitches of the triad, but shifted to unoccupied octaves. With voice lead on, these duplicates are intelligently generated to result in the most efficient transition between your voicings. This will give us a good start. Let's open our DAW. In this video, I'm going to be using Logic Pro and Native Instruments Kontakt player with a variety of orchestral libraries. I'll start by adding an instrument track with Kontakt 7. I'm going to select Multi-Stereo times 16. I'm going to label this track Cymasphere Orchestra and change the icon. Think of the instrument track as the hub where all your Kontakt instruments are hosted and where all the MIDI is received. It actually won't be used to output any audio. We send the audio from each instrument to a separate aux stereo track. So next, let's open Kontakt. I'll start by configuring my outputs. As a multi-output instance of Kontakt, I'm going to create aux tracks for each instrument loaded into my rack. Open the output section and select the stereo times 16 configuration, giving us 16 discrete stereo aux outputs. Next, I'm going to start adding instruments I'd like to add to my orchestra. Let's start with strings. I'm going to add bass, cello, viola, violin, tuba, trombones, trumpet, oboe, flute, and clarinet. Okay, I have 10 instruments. That should be a good starting point. Let's assign each instrument's output to use a separate aux. Let's skip aux 1, which is defaulted for Cymasphere orchestra track, which we don't want to have any audio playing from. Let's assign the MIDI channel inputs for each instrument. I'm going to set the bass and tuba MIDI inputs to channel 1. I'm going to set the cello and trombone MIDI inputs to channel 2. Viola, channel 3. Violin and trumpet, channel 4. Oboe and clarinet, channel 5. Flute, channel 6. Whatever channels you ultimately decide, make sure that you assign to each instrument a voice that will fall within its playable range. One more note. By default, each instrument is set to use the sustain articulation. Articulations can be triggered in various ways, including note on messages outside of its playable range. You want to make sure that you're not accidentally sending note on messages that will trigger articulation changes to the instrument if you're not intending to do so. In Logic, open the mix window using the Command 2 hotkey. Next to the Cymasphere Orchestra track, you will see a plus sign. Click that 10 times to create 10 separate tracks for Kontakt's auxes. Name the aux tracks according to their order in the Kontakt instance. Select all your aux tracks, right-click, and select Create Track so they appear in the main window. I like to give each track an icon to make them stand out. Let's record enable the Cymasphere Orchestra track. Right-click the solo button to solo safe the Cymasphere Orchestra track, which will allow you to solo instruments. Play a cymatic in Cymasphere. You should see signal hitting your Kontakt instance. Sometimes it takes a few seconds for Kontakt to warm up as it's loading all the samples, but after that it should play immediately. You can optionally add some swell tracks. Each swell track is just a bus that you can direct your various instrument aux tracks to. On each aux track is a tremolo plugin that is set to use a very slow speed such as 4 bars, 8 bars, or 16 bars. And this allows the instruments being sent to the swell track to have a more dynamic presence by modulating their volume within some type of range that you can define. Save your session and you should be ready to start composing.